Hi, I'm Philip Kemp. In 1934, Alfred Hitchcock directed the first of 6 films he would make for the Gaumont British Studios in London. He's perhaps now better known for the movies he made in America, but this, The Man Who Knew Too Much, was the film that launched his international reputation and that would set the pattern for nearly every film he made for the rest of his career. Hitchcock always believed in letting the audience know, very early on in a film, just where they were, whether London or New York or San Francisco. He didn't want them to be distracted from the story by wondering, but where is all this happening? So here, there's no doubt, we're in Switzerland. Specifically in St. Moritz, where Hitchcock and his wife Alma had spent their honeymoon, and where they returned almost every year, apart from the war years, for the rest of their lives. Hitch was nothing if not a man of regular habits. Although, as you might guess, he was never really into skiing. Of course, we're not actually in Switzerland. A few stock shots, a few not over-convincing photographic backdrops. This is the Gaumont British Studios in Shepherd's Bush, West London, where nearly all the film was shot. Very little of it, as was customary in the 1930s, was shot on location. Both The Lodger from 1926 and Blackmail from 1929 have been suggested as the first real Hitchcock film. But as Hitchcock himself remarked, I think you'll find the real start of my career was The Man Who Knew Too Much. It may still be a little rough around the edges, but here, for the first time, we find Hitchcock's battery of audience-unsettling devices in full swing. Here can be found the tongue-in-cheek black humour, the disdain for mere surface plausibility, the wry sense of incongruity, revealing the sinister or macabre lurking within the most drably mundane setting, and, of course, the sure, probing touch on our own fears and vulnerabilities.
Hello, Louis.
Here's the moment where Louis Bernard's fate is sealed. Abbott, with his split-second change of expression from jocular to malevolent, a switch that Peter Lorre could always effect with utmost skill, shows that he's recognised the Frenchman. Louis, for his part, simply looks slightly puzzled. He feels he's seen Abbott before somewhere, but where?
No more jumping?
No, that was my last chance. Oh, your fault, terrible woman.
It wasn't. It was a silly little dog.
I might have been killed, you know. You realize that my last day here might have been my last day on Earth.
This might have been my last day on Earth, remarks Louis Bernard. As, of course, it is. Hitch loved to slip in double-edged lines like this. We'll hear another very soon, when Jill tells Raymond, "We must have another battle someday." His patronising response, "I shall live for that moment," is, like Louis' comment, far truer than he knows. Here, by the way, is the first of several incidents of shaky continuity we'll see in this film. What became of the dog? We never see nor hear of it again. Like quite a few other characters, it simply vanishes from the film once it's served its dramatic purpose. Incidentally, if you're waiting for the director's cameo appearance, you may be disappointed. There's a point in about half an hour's time where some people believe they've spotted Hitch. Personally, I doubt if it's him, but I'll point it out when we get there.
Don't you like him, Trouble?
Do you?
I don't know.
The Man Who Knew Too Much came at a point when Hitchcock's career was at something of a low ebb. He'd started out in 1919 at Gainsborough Studios in North London, where he directed his first 5 films for the producer Michael Balkan. But then he was tempted away by the promise of more money to a newly formed company, British International Pictures, commonly known as BIP, headed by John Maxwell. He directed 11 films there, including the first British sound feature, Blackmail, but often found himself assigned to material such as filmed plays by John Galsworthy and Sean O'Casey, to which he felt unsuited. Finally, in 1933, he decided to resign and signed up with the producer-director Alexander Korda, who was just starting up operations in London. But Korda, as so often, was ambitious but cash-strapped, and after waiting several months, Hitchcock realised that the producer couldn't afford to use him. So, in some desperation, he accepted an offer from an independent producer, Tom Arnold, to direct a film version of a West End stage hit, Waltzes from Vienna, about Johann Strauss the Younger. This was the sort of costumed fluff that Hitch loathed. Luckily, Arnold was renting space at Shepherd's Bush Studios, now the headquarters of the Gaumont British Corporation, where Hitchcock's old boss Michael Balkan had become head of production. Wandering onto the set one day, Balkan asked the director what he was doing next. "Nothing yet," said Hitch meaningfully. Balkan promptly signed him up for what was to become the great run of 6 thrillers that would gain him international fame, earn him a ticket to Hollywood, and come to define what we might call the Hitchcock brand. Also at Gaumont British were several of Hitch's old Gainsborough friends and colleagues, including Angus MacPhail, the story editor, and Ivor Montague, who had rescued the lodger from potential disaster and became Hitchcock's associate producer on most of the Gaumont films. Hitch brought with him another man who became a close associate, scripting his next 5 films, the playwright and screenwriter Charles Bennett.
You're a marvellous shot.
So within the first 5 minutes of the film, Hitch has introduced us to almost all the main characters. Bob Lawrence, his wife Jill, their daughter Betty, ski champion Louis Bernard, gang leader Abbott, chief heavy Raymond, and Abbott's companion Nurse Agnes. In the shooting script, incidentally, Raymond's name is Levine, but it was no doubt felt, given what was happening in Europe, that to give the nastiest character a Jewish name would be less than advisable.
You go to bed early. With Betty. Poor Daddy.
The playful flirtation between Jill and Louis, apparently condoned by Bob, is typical of Hitchcock's delight in introducing sly hints of sexual naughtiness into his films. In the shooting script, this scenario is staged for the benefit of 2 disapproving English spinsters, Miss Thorpe and Miss Haggerston, who are shocked and titillated by such decadent behaviour. They were dropped from the film as shot, but a trace of them remains, as we'll see in a moment. Notice how Hitchcock, in his establishing shot of the ballroom, emphasises the wide, curving, panoramic window. It means that anyone outside with a rifle, as of course Raymond now is, though we never see him, will have the maximum chance of getting a good shot at his target. But in the meantime, the mood is light and playful, with more banter between Louis and Jill at Bob's expense. Hitch is known as the master of suspense, and with good reason. But sometimes he liked to surprise his audience, lulling them into a false sense of security, as he's doing here.
Do your stuff.
What do you think of the average Englishman?
Much too cold. Except when he drinks too much, of course.
Is that jumper for him?
Of course it is. Did you think it was for you?
That knitting's a bit odd, isn't it? Would a stylish young woman like Jill really bring her knitting to dinner in a smart hotel? It seems unlikely, to say the least. The answer's in those 2 now deleted spinsters. In the shooting script, the knitting belongs to Miss Thorpe, who's sitting with her friend at the next table. But even though the spinsters have gone, Hitch clearly couldn't resist retaining the knitting for this sight gag. It's the device that allows him to suddenly switch registers from comedy to violence. As he liked to remark, death comes when you least expect it. Well, it does in his movies anyway. The gag could also take on a more doom-laden significance. As Hitchcock himself noted, it's the thread of life that gets broken, he explained, adding, one could still get pretentious in those days.
Look.
Oh, look, says Louis, seeing the blood on his chest, and then, I'm sorry. In this film, no one dies with melodramatic writhing and moans. At most, a look of surprise, as if they can't quite believe what's happened to them.
Tell Bob. Maroon brush in my room. Take it to the British Council.
It's to the credit of Michael Balkan, Hitchcock told Francois Truffaut, that he originally started me as a director, and later gave me a second chance. Balkan, who had always recognised Hitchcock's exceptional talent, had the sense to make all the necessary business decisions, while leaving Hitchcock creatively alone to do what he did best. Of Hitchcock's previous 17 films, only 4 can be classified as thrillers. From The Man Who Knew Too Much onwards, he would direct almost nothing else, with the 1941 screwball comedy Mr. and Mrs. Smith the only major exception. With this film, and under Balkan's shrewd guidance, Alfred Hitchcock honed in on his true métier. The Man Who Knew Too Much had its origins in a treatment that Hitchcock had devised with Charles Bennett, whom he'd met at British International when Bennett's stage play was being adapted for blackmail. While they were still under contract to BIP, Hitchcock and Bennett came up with an idea for a thriller to be called Bulldog Drummond's Baby, which also stole an idea or two from John Buchan's novel The Three Hostages. Bulldog Drummond was the two-fisted hero of a series of popular thrillers by H.C. McNeill, who wrote under the pen name of Sapper. In these novels, influenced by Arthur Conan Doyle and John Buchan, the valiant Captain Hugh Drummond battled the nefarious doings of sinister Europeans and treacherous Orientals, their villainy usually directed by Drummond's nemesis, the infinitely cunning mastermind Dr. Carl Peterson. In the end, of course, true British pluck and resourcefulness invariably win out. Since BIP held the film rights to Sapper's novels and characters, Hitchcock and Bennett's idea could have suited the studio well. Their story involved Drummond's child, a 5-year-old son in the original outline, being kidnapped by the criminals to keep his father quiet about a planned assassination. John Maxwell, though, turned down the idea, saying it would be too expensive to make. Now, at Gaumont British, Hitchcock told Balkan that he and Bennett had a story all ready to go, and that he could buy it back from Maxwell for £500. In fact, he knew Maxwell would sell the property for £250 and Hitchcock could pocket the difference. Hitch later claimed that he was so conscience-stricken about this deception that he used the money to commission the sculptor Jacob Epstein to make a bust of Balkan and presented it to him. With Balkan's blessing, the project went ahead. A script entitled The Hidden Hand was submitted to the British Film Censor in February 1934. The lead character was still called Hugh Drummond, and the plot followed the general outlines of the film as we now have it, though Drummond's wife scarcely figured. The kidnapped child had become an adolescent girl, nearer in age to Hitchcock's own daughter Pat. The censor had no major objections, apart from requesting the excision of 2 occurrences of the word bloody, and objecting to some scenes showing a liaison between a peer and a demi-mondaine. This element, said the censor, should be entirely deleted. In May 1934, the script was back again, now entitled The Man Who Knew Too Much, a title borrowed from a collection of short stories by G.K. Chesterton. Hugh Drummond had been renamed Bob Lawrence, and again his wife played little part in the action. The censor's concern this time centred on the final gun battle between the criminal gang and the police, in which the police would be armed and backed up by troops. The journalist Beverly Baxter, acting as a freelance script supervisor for Gaumont British, was called in for a discussion with a Mr. Wilkinson from the British Board of Film Censors. According to the censor's report, Baxter agreed not to arm the police, but wanted to retain the soldiers. Mr. Wilkinson told Baxter our objections in detail, and he finally agreed that he would endeavour to alter the ending so as to bring it in accord with ordinary police methods in London. As we'll see, Hitchcock largely ignored this agreement.
Is he here in St. Moritz?
By the time we come to the full shooting script, which is undated, but must date from only a week or two after that meeting with the censors, a key element has been added to the plot, the crucial involvement of Bob's wife Jill, whose sharpshooting skills proved so vital in the film's denouement. Up to now, the women in Hitchcock's thrillers, The Lodger, Blackmail, the 1930 Murder, and the 1932 Number 17, had been essentially passive figures, more acted upon than acting. Jill Lawrence becomes the first of a string of far more resourceful women in the Gaumont British films, in Secret Agent, Young and Innocent, and The Lady Vanishes. After Hitchcock moves to America, resourceful women still show up in his films. Consider, among others, the heroines of Shadow of a Doubt, Spellbound, Stage Fright, and North by Northwest. We might detect in this the influence of Hitchcock's writing partner Charles Bennett, who often liked to end his screenplays with a strong couple united or reunited. Bennett, who scripted the first 5 of the 6 Gaumont movies, noted wryly of Hitch that he had a monstrous ego that matched his appetite. Even so, the two men got on well together. Years later, Bennett described their typical working day. After a couple of hours at the studio in the morning talking over the script, he recalled, "At about 1 o'clock, everything would stop and we'd go to lunch at the Mayfair Hotel. Always a wonderful lunch. Then come back, and at that point Hitch would usually go to sleep in the office, and I would do a little work and possibly doze off too. But about 5 o'clock we would go back to Hitchcock's flat, where we would start having nice cocktails and talk more and more about the script. And I think more work was done on the script in the evening over cocktails than at any other time. By opening on a close-up of the brooch that Jill gave Betty, and then dissolving from it to reveal first the kidnapped girl, and then Raymond, Hitchcock fixes the brooch in our minds as a symbol of Betty, preparing us for the later scene, where Raymond gives it to Jill in the lobby of the Royal Albert Hall to remind her that her daughter is still in peril. Fade from a shot of Switzerland, and we're back in London. To British audiences of the period, this stock shot of the neon signs at Piccadilly Circus would have been instantly recognisable, though perhaps less so in other countries.
I've nothing to add to what I've already said, Inspector. Nothing whatever.
Oh, so you was talking like that, Mr. Lawrence. It just won't do. Now, on March the 10th, you and Mrs. Lawrence went to Switzerland.
Thank you. Yes.
Let's talk a little about the cast.
Yes?
Leslie Banks, playing Bob Lawrence, specialised in stolid, unflappable Englishmen with a quiet line in self-deprecating wit. He starred in The Most Dangerous Game, otherwise known as The Hounds of Zaroff, took the title role in Sanders of the River, and during the war was a natural for staunch, taciturn officer types.
Yes. One for you.
Thank you. Where is she?
Staying with her aunt.
Oh, what's his aunt's name?
Mary.
Hitchcock liked working with him. He found him quiet, cultured and charming, and would use him again, this time cast against type as a ruthless smuggler, in Jamaica Inn. His bluff screen persona was interestingly undermined in the Ealing wartime drama Went the Day Well, where he played the seemingly dependable village squire who turns out to be a Nazi fifth columnist.
Kidnapped?
Edna Best, who plays Bob's sharpshooting wife Jill, was at this time married to the actor Herbert Marshall. She was better known as a stage actress, generally cast as well-bred and lively middle-class ladies, and made relatively few films. The Man Who Knew Too Much is her best-known movie. After the war, she went to Hollywood and appeared in films like The Late George Apsley and The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. In real life, she was not a sharpshooter, but a swimming champion.
Doesn't play with it much now, does she?
She never did. You never gave her a chance.
Here's the only other major character in the film, Bob and Jill's friend Clive, played by Hugh Wakefield, an actor who specialised in upper-class roles. At one point, Jill refers to him as Uncle Clive, but Bob just calls him my pal. So whether he's Betty's real uncle or an honorary uncle is left vague. Clive is an all but superfluous character, essentially a leftover from the Bulldog Drummond version of the script, where he was Drummond's regular sidekick Algy Longworth, a good-hearted fellow but not over-bright, a cross between Dr. Watson and a P.G. Wodehouse silly ass.
What I mean to say is, once you begin that sort of thing, lose grip and...
Clive's monocle immediately labels him a buffoon, an impression reinforced by his childish delight in playing with Betty's train set. Once he's carried out his one action essential to the plot, telling Jill to go to the Albert Hall, he's another character who simply vanishes from the film. The last we see of the poor fellow, he's being hauled off by a pair of cops, protesting loudly. Although originally in the shooting script he was to show up again, right at the very end of the film. There was a final scene, after Betty and her parents had been reunited, showing Clive in court being convicted by the magistrate for disorderly behaviour in a place of worship, and, much to his indignation, given the option of a £1 fine or a week in jail. But in the end the scene was dropped. A pity. It could have made an enjoyably jokey ending. Slightly clumsy blocking here. From Bob's reaction, we're meant to understand that he hadn't noticed that Gibson was still in the room.
Hello, you still here?
But he walked straight past him and would surely have seen him.
I'm not a policeman. My name's Gibson. I'm secretary to Sir Norman Wood at the Foreign Office.
Oh, really? Never heard of him.
In The Man Who Knew Too Much, we get for the first time a theme that would recur time and again in Hitchcock's subsequent films, the idea of ordinary people being helplessly caught up in far larger events in the machinations of spy rings or international politics. This was something relatively new in British crime thrillers, which until then had tended to favour Sherlock Holmes or Agatha Christie-style detection stories, or melodramatic mastermind fantasies adapted from the like of Edgar Wallace, E. Phillips Oppenheim, or Sapper. Hitchcock must have felt that a man who knew too much would encourage his audience to identify with the protagonists, imagining how they too would feel if they were caught up in events far beyond their control. This theme would form the basis of 5 out of his 6 Gaumont films, Young and Innocent being the sole exception, and we find it again in several of his American films, Foreign Correspondent, Saboteur, Lifeboat, Notorious, North by Northwest, and, of course, in the 1956 remake of The Man Who Knew Too Much. There hangs over all 6 of Hitchcock's Gaumont movies, but perhaps most heavily over the first and last of them, The Man Who Knew Too Much and The Lady Vanishes, the shadow of events in Europe and elsewhere. Hitchcock was always well abreast of contemporary politics, and even if he hadn't been, the fact that so many of his colleagues at the studio were Jewish or German Jewish would have kept him very much aware of what was going on. He joined Gaumont British the same year that a very different Mr. A.H., Adolf Hitler, became Reichskanzler of Germany.
Heard of or assassinated.
Tell me, in June 1914, had you ever heard of a place called Sarajevo? Of course you hadn't. I doubt if you'd even heard of the Archduke Ferdinand. But in a month's time, because a man you'd never heard of killed another man you'd never heard of, in a place you'd never heard of, this country was at war.
So, in The Man Who Knew Too Much, as in Hitch's subsequent films, we can clearly detect the apprehension aroused by the renewed rise of Germany and the fear that another world war might be looming. That message is clearly spelt out here in Gibson's speech, where he draws parallels with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand at Sarajevo in 1914, which sparked off the First World War. In the shooting script, Bob backs up Gibson's arguments, telling his wife, "We mustn't get cross at Mr. Gibson, Jill. Betty is ours, not his. He has to think of all the other people and their Bettys. We went through 4.5 years of it, and we don't want anybody to do it again." This speech, which spells everything out rather too heavy-handedly, was wisely dropped.
Just a final warning.
Yes, but I want to...
Bob, what is it?
I don't know, somebody playing the fool or something.
Back to the cast. Playing Bob and Jill's daughter Betty is Nova Pilbeam, 14 at the time our film was shot. She was one of the best British child actors of the 30s, hailed for her performance in her debut film, Little Friend, directed by the Austrian émigré Bertolt Viertel, where she plays a sensitive young girl driven to attempt suicide by her parents' divorce. The Man Who Knew Too Much was Pilbeam's second film, made only a few weeks later. Hitchcock said of her, she had the intelligence of a fully grown woman. He was to use her again as the heroine of Young and Innocent. In 1939, she married the young director Penn Tennyson, who was Hitchcock's assistant director on The Man Who Knew Too Much and The 39 Steps. We'll return to Penn Tennyson a bit later. Like so many child actors, Pilbeam saw her career falter when she graduated to adult roles, though not through any lack of ability. Her performance as a Dutch refugee in her last major film, the Ealing wartime propaganda movie The Next of Kin, was exceptional. But she retired from acting before she was 30. At the time of this commentary, Nova Pilbeam is still alive, aged 92. Pierre Freinet, as Louis Bernard, had famously played Marius in Marcel Pagnol's Marseille set trilogy of Marius, Fanny and César, and would later play de Boieldieu in Renoir's great anti-war movie Grand Illusion. At the time our film was shot, he was starring in a West End play with his wife Yvonne Printemps. Hitchcock later told François Truffaut he didn't really want to cast a Frenchman in this role, and that it was Ivor Montague's idea, which is strange, given that in the remake he casts another French actor, Daniel Gélin. Frank Vosper, who plays the chief heavy, Raymond, was a playwright as well as an actor. His lady in peril thriller, Love from a Stranger, adapted from a short story by Agatha Christie, has been filmed more than once. He often played urbane aristocrats. He was Prince Gustav in Hitchcock's Waltzes from Vienna, the Duke in Lothar Mendes' 1934 version of Leon Feuchtwanger's Jew Seuss, not to be confused with Veit Harlan's loathsome anti-Semitic remake of 1940. And one of his most successful stage roles was as Henry VIII. Vosper's death was mysterious. In 1937, coming back by ocean liner from mounting a production of Love from a Stranger in New York, he fell overboard and was drowned. It was suggested he might have committed suicide, but if so, there seemed no reason for it. Vosper was at the height of his fame and success. Cicely Oates, as Abbott's austere companion, is something of an enigmatic figure. She made only 8 films, of which The Man Who Knew Too Much is by far the most famous, and died a few months after it was completed, aged only 35. The film's mainstay, according to the critic Peter John Dyer, is its refined sense of the incongruous, and never more so than in this middle section, taking us from the dentist's surgery to the sun worshipper's chapel, and kicking off with that startling shot of a set of giant teeth. Notice how Hitchcock creates his working-class East End scene, a studio set, of course, through low-level lighting and sound effects, pub piano, distant snatches of song, motor horns, and, just to remind us we're near the river and the docks, the melancholy sound of ship sirens. Hitchcock knew just how to tap into universal fears. Look how often the fear of falling from a high place features in his movies. And as he was well aware, most of us have a horror of dentists. Originally, it seems the venue for this next scene was to have been a barber shop, with everyone's faces concealed by hot towels. But shortly before shooting, he saw Mervyn LeRoy's I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which had a very similar sequence, and got Bennett to change it to a dental surgery. Far more effective, since we're all much more afraid of dentists than of barbers. And this may well have inspired the famous scene in John Schlesinger's Marathon Man, with Dustin Hoffman being tortured by Laurence Olivier's Nazi dentist. This dentist comes across as a bit Nazi too, doesn't he?
Look at it. Come on. Here.
The film's casting stroke of genius was the choice of Peter Lorre to play the gang leader, Abbott. This was a last-minute inspiration, largely at the suggestion of associate producer Ivor Montague. In the shooting script, Abbott is described as an elderly, genial Englishman of around 60, wearing gold-rimmed glasses, not at all like the squat, Germanic, moon-faced 30-year-old Lorre. Born Laszlo Löwenstein in Hungary of Jewish stock, Lorre had achieved stardom as the child murderer Franz Becker in Fritz Lang's first sound film, M. Like so many others in the German film industry, he quit the country in 1933, heading for Paris. He made one film in France, but given his limited French, roles were hard to come by, and he was soon desperately short of money. Montague, who along with his friends Sidney Bernstein and Michael Balkan actively worked to bring Jewish actors and technicians to England, heard that Lorre was living in Paris in straitened circumstances and raised funds to bring him to London. He introduced him to Hitchcock with the initial idea of casting him as the hitman, eventually played by Frank Vosper. Hitch took to Lorre immediately, appreciating his deadpan sense of humour and taste for the incongruous. Lorre, though, always maintained that at this stage his English was even sketchier than his French. But, knowing that Hitchcock loved to tell funny stories, he claimed that, "I always used to watch him like a hawk, and whenever I thought the end of a story was coming, I used to roar with laughter. And somehow, he got the impression that I spoke English." Classic Hitchcock cinematic shorthand here, with two major characters reintroduced by means of personal idiosyncrasies, both of them linked to Betty. First, Abbott with the chiming watch that he unsuccessfully tried to amuse her with, and then, in a few moments, Raymond with his over-brilliantined hair that the girl found so repellent.
She's not due until tomorrow.
At all events, Lorre, with, he said, the help of a lot of black coffee, soon picked up the language, and Hitchcock decided he would be ideal for the role of Abbott, the leader of the gang. The studio bosses took some convincing, since Lorre was barely known in England. Lang's M, being in German, had been seen mainly by art house audiences. But Montague and Hitchcock talked them round, and Lorre repaid their trust by giving one of his finest performances, switching subtly from shy affability to chilling menace. He appreciated the ambiguity of the role, as he hated being typecast as a blatant villain. "I had to be villain enough," he later recalled, "for a child to instinctively dislike me, yet for grown-ups to see nothing out of the ordinary in me. Two more German immigrants played major parts in the production, both of them men whom Hitchcock had met when, before he directed his first film, he had been sent by Michael Balkan as assistant director on several Gainsborough productions shot in Berlin's giant UFA studios. Wish fulfillment here, perhaps? That nightmare figure, the dentist, has the tables turned on him and is given a taste of his own medicine. Again, Hitchcock taps into some of our own less respectable fantasies. Alfred Junge was one of the most notable art directors of the great German silent period. This was his second film for Hitchcock after Waltzes from Vienna, and he would also work on Young and Innocent, and would later become the favourite production designer of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger on such films as The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp and Black Narcissus. The cinematographer Kurt Courant was another UFA veteran. This was his only film for Hitchcock, perhaps because of a disagreement early in the shoot. Hitchcock very rarely troubled to look through the camera, but on this occasion he suspected that Courant wasn't doing what he'd been told. A glance through the viewfinder confirmed it, and Courant was told off in Hitchcock's limited but expressive German. After that, it seems, he behaved himself. And there's that unmistakable brilliantine head, reintroducing Raymond. Courant later went on to work with Jean Renoir, Marcel Carnet, and Charlie Chaplin on Monsieur Verdoux.
It is the last time I let myself be smuggled into this country, for you or anybody else.
You will be smuggled, my friend, when, how, and where I'm pleased for you to be smuggled. Yes?
Perhaps to make him all the more outlandish and sinister, Laurie is given a facial scar, as well as the shock of white in his hair that makes him look like a distant cousin of Elsa Lanchester in The Bride of Frankenstein. But he really doesn't need them. Charles Bennett later wrote of Laurie, Peter carried his personal gentleness into his characterizations, and this was a great part of his magic. He could kill and still remain amusingly lovable.
Oh, in a little hole in the ground somewhere. You shall see.
Like Bennett, Hitchcock thoroughly enjoyed Laurie's company as well as his performance, and was to cast him again 2 years later in The Secret Agent. By now, Laurie was establishing his career in Hollywood, but Hitch persuaded Michael Balkan to have him brought over specially to play an eccentric double agent called the Hairless Mexican, who was, in fact, neither Mexican nor hairless.
Look, Clive, which way they go? Where's Betty? Found out anything? Yes. Shall I give Jill a ring? No, come along. Hurry.
Here comes the point where some people think they've spotted a Hitchcock cameo. On the right of the screen, wearing a shiny coat and hat, crossing the road just as the Isle of Man bus passes. Just there. Personally, I doubt whether it's him, just a portly extra. But see what you think. If it is Hitch, it's certainly the briefest and most unobtrusive of all his cameos. Now we come to another of Hitchcock's wickedly incongruous venues, the Sun Worshippers' Chapel, which doubles as a hideout for Abbott and his gang. Initially, the sign over the chapel door, with its sun's rays, also incorporated an eye.
Sun worshippers.
The British censor got very worried about this symbol, which he referred to as the all-seeing eye, and more than once asked that it be removed, which evidently it eventually was. It's not quite clear what troubled the censor so much about this eye. Perhaps he thought it could be taken as representing the eye of God, and thus the film might be considered to be mocking religion. Some of the executives at Gaumont British were also a little worried about the whole chapel sequence. A letter from one of them survives in Ivor Montagu's papers saying, "Presumably inquiry will have been made to see that no sect or organisation exists which might claim that the sun worshippers of the film have been based upon them. In the event, it seems that no sect complained. If they had, it might have been less for the implication that they harboured a criminal gang than because the congregation was depicted as such a drab, dreary bunch." Here's another example of Hitchcock's mischievous, often irreverent sense of humour. Bob and Clive improvising their own words to the hymn.
Clive, 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 that woman at the end, half left to you and me.
This is an old schoolboy game, perhaps indulged in by even so well-behaved a pupil as young Alfred at his strict Jesuit school, and it feeds into the sense of incongruity that's so characteristic and entertaining a feature of The Man Who Knew Too Much. The credits for the film name two screenwriters, Charles Bennett and D.B. Wyndham Lewis. Welsh-born Dominic Bevan Wyndham Lewis, not to be confused with the vorticist writer and painter, was a humorist, journalist, and prolific biographer, co-editor of the classic anthology of bad verse, The Stuffed Owl. Just what he contributed to the script is unclear. According to Bennett, he was brought in while we were working on Bulldog Drummond's Baby to write some dialogue which was never used, but since he had been brought in, it was decided to give him a story credit, which he was never entitled to. A very lovely guy. However, since Wyndham Lewis is credited with the libretto for Arthur Benjamin's Storm Cloud cantata, maybe his involvement was less marginal than Bennett made out. At all events, given his taste for bad verse, it could well be that he devised the words of the lugubrious hymn that we hear being sung in the chapel, all 6 stanzas of them. I won't inflict all of them on you, but here are the first 2. Praise we Apollo's beams, which rule all life below, the flaming eye which gleams, the arrow from the bow. Praise we great Mithras, who once ruled the world entire, and Ra the sun god too, with all his hosts of fire. This hypnotism scene was something else that got the British censor rather agitated, though again it's not clear why, and at all events the scene stayed in. But then at this time, the British Board of Film Censors were a notoriously touchy bunch, maybe even more so than their American counterparts in the Hayes office. A few years previously, they had famously banned Germaine Dulac's surrealist drama, The Seashell and the Clergyman, with the words, "This film is so obscure as to have no apparent meaning. If there is a meaning, it is doubtless objectionable."
Relax. Keep your eyes fixed on this light. Keep them fixed. Before receiving the first degree of the sevenfold ray, your mind must be white and blank.
And now another joke at poor old Clive's expense. Your mind is becoming quite blank, says Nurse Agnes.
Your mind is becoming quite blank. You feel that, don't you? Quite blank.
Yes.
We can't help reflecting that blank is probably his normal state.
Blank.
Here, for the second time, Hitchcock gives us a subjective shot of the screen going blurry to suggest loss of consciousness, a common enough device these days, but relatively unusual then. The first example was when Jill fainted on learning of Betty's abduction, and the third we'll see quite soon in the Albert Hall sequence. Although the chapel ostensibly purports to house sun worshippers, presumably free-thinking pagans of some sort, its cheerless architecture and congregation of dowdy elderly women strongly suggest one of the more austere Protestant sects. In the remake, indeed, that's exactly what they become. No such explicit caricature would ever have been allowed at Gaumont British, where Michael Balkan, as a non-practicing Jew, the son of immigrant parents, was always wary of anything that might offend religious sensibilities. When at Ealing 15 years later he produced the classic comedy Whiskey Galore, he insisted that the element of Protestant-Catholic rivalry in Compton Mackenzie's source novel be totally excised from the movie adaptation. The gun-toting Mrs. Sprocket isn't credited, but she's played by Claire Greet, a veteran character actress who appeared in several of Hitchcock's films. Besides this one, she played a gypsy fortune teller in the 1927 The Ring, and also appeared in the 1929 The Manx Man, and Hitchcock's last British film before his departure for America, Jamaica Inn. That was her final role. She died the same year, 1939, aged 67. She's another of the disappearing characters. After the indignity of having to serve tea in her bloomers, she vanishes from the rest of the film.
He's subject to apoplexy. Who?
Hitchcock's assistant director on this film, and on his next one, The 39 Steps, was a 22-year-old called Penrose Tennyson. Pen Tennyson, as he was always known, was a great-grandson of Alfred Lord Tennyson, Queen Victoria's favourite poet laureate, and a great favourite also of Michael Balkan, who treated him almost like a son. Hitch, too, liked him, though he made him the butt of some of his habitual practical jokes, and at one point persuaded him to dress up in drag as a body double for Madeleine Carroll in The 39 Steps. Tennyson later followed Balkan to Ealing Studios, where he was promoted to director. He directed 3 promising films, There Ain't No Justice, The Proud Valley, starring Paul Robeson, and Convoy, and in 1939 married Nova Pilbeam. His career was cut tragically short in 1941. Having joined the Navy's instructional film unit, he was on a flight from Scapa Flow to Rosyth when his plane, in broad daylight, ploughed into a hillside and all on board were killed. The name of another future film director shows up in the crew of The Man Who Knew Too Much. Listed as principal clapperboy was the 23-year-old Robert Hamer. He too would join Michael Balkan at Ealing, where, among other things, he directed It Always Rains on Sunday and the classic black comedy Kind Hearts and Coronets.
No shooting. You don't want the police here, do you? Stop playing that organ, or they'll hear this noise outside.
You can't help suspecting, though, that Hitch, born and brought up Catholic, was slyly poking fun at some of the least attractive aspects of low church, backstreet Protestantism, and then mischievously indulging in a hint of sacrilege by making a chapel the venue for a rowdy chair fight, complete with the accompaniment of pious organ music. Here's another continuity glitch. Louis Bernard's all-important scrap of paper reads A Hall, March 21st, but the tickets in Raymond's pockets are clearly marked 22nd March. Strange nobody picked this one up.
Through the window. Phone Jill. Tell her to go to the Albert Hall. All the beast!
The Man Who Knew Too Much is unique in Hitchcock's output, in that it's the only one of his films that he chose to remake. True, he returned time and again to very much the same plot, the innocent man on the run, pursued by cops and villains alike, being a particular favourite, showing up in The 39 Steps, Saboteur, and North by Northwest. But this is the only explicit remake, right down to using the same title. Other directors have tried remaking Hitchcock movies, Psycho, The Lodger, The Lady Vanishes, generally with pretty disastrous results.
Please forgive me.
So, how did the master himself make out in the remake stakes? The idea of remaking the film in Hollywood had occurred to Hitch as early as 1941, when he and the producer John Houseman worked on a rewrite of the script. But they couldn't crack it, and it wasn't until 1955 that he got round to starting work on it again. Mainly, according to his daughter Pat, because he owed Paramount a film to fulfill his contract. He called in his regular screenwriter of the time, John Michael Hayes, to fashion a new version, although Hayes later claimed he was forbidden to watch the original and had to rely on Hitchcock relating the film to him. James Stewart and Doris Day were cast as the anguished parents, and the film's opening was shifted from St. Moritz to Marrakesh, though the rest of the film still takes place in London. The new film, of course, was made in colour and ran 119 minutes against the earlier version 75. The two versions of The Man Who Knew Too Much have provided a fertile source of debate between the partisans of Hitchcock's British movies and those of his American work. For François Truffaut, interviewing Hitch in 1962, the matter was clear-cut. The remake, he asserted confidently, is far superior to the original.
Hello. Is that
Hitchcock's response, characteristically, sounds ostensibly like agreement while leaving the question wide open. Let's say that the first version is the work of a talented amateur and the second was made by a professional. Later, interviewed by David Castell for Film News, he was less equivocal, saying that the earlier version was more spontaneous, it had less logic. Logic is dull. You always lose the bizarre and the spontaneous. The critic Robin Wood, a staunch proponent of Hitchcock's Hollywood period, dismissed the 1934 version as a pleasant minor entertainment, adding that the lingering belief that it is superior to the American version is incomprehensible outside the most flagrant chauvinism. Against that, Penelope Houston, longtime editor of Sight and Sound, felt that Hitch had traded in the casual audacity of the 1934 version for an academic exercise in suspense building that flatly misfires. Where the earlier film went like a bullet, the remake weightily ambles. For what it's worth, on balance I come down on the side of the earlier version. The remake seems to me too long and far too slow, and the Marrakesh sequence feels padded out with endless stretches of touristic local colour. We're 35 minutes in before the child, a boy this time, is kidnapped, at which point the 1934 version is almost half over. The element of a world potentially on the brink of war has vanished, making the parents' decision not to tell the authorities what they know much less fraught. This time around, it's simply a question of an internal feud, with the unnamed country's UK ambassador scheming to have his Prime Minister assassinated. In John Michael Hayes' original script, incidentally, the country was indicated as one of the Iron Curtain states, and the couple played by Bernard Miles and Brenda de Banzi were identified as British communists. But Paramount, not wanting to alienate overseas audiences, ordered these elements toned down to the point where they're barely noticeable. In the climax of the remake, having the mother rescue her son by singing loudly so that he'll hear her and join in by whistling the tune seems inanely over-contrived, Hitchcock's lazy way of satisfying the studio's demand that Doris Day must provide a song or two. It's a far less effective device than Edna Best's sharpshooting skills. James Stewart gives a bad-tempered one-note performance, snapping testily at everybody. And as the chief baddie, Bernard Miles, sound actor though he was, isn't a patch on Peter Lorre on any count.
My pal has a little girl. At least he hasn't now, that's the whole point. He came down here to look for her. And these chaps, I mean this fella here...
Here's almost the last we see of poor Clive, gasping inarticulately, like a fish out of water, at the accusations smoothly levelled at him by Abbott and Nurse Agnes, hopelessly outwitted by their superior guile.
Is that what we want to charge you with?
Alas, yes. We don't wish to press it, officer, but we've been very patient, haven't we, sister?
Oh, but Dammy, Now, what are you going to say for yourself? Look here.
The one scene which, to me, does work better in the remake is the Royal Albert Hall set piece. Again, it uses Arthur Benjamin's Storm Cloud cantata, but extended by the composer and powerfully rescored by Bernard Herrmann, who also scored the rest of the movie and plays the Albert Hall conductor on screen. Having the piece played out at greater length, I feel, gives a more powerful build-up of tension. That apart, though, my vote goes to the 1934 version every time. Once again, we're reminded of Charles Bennett's remarks about Laurie, that thanks to his personal gentleness, and, we could add, his perverse sense of humour, he could say and do the most appalling things without ceasing to appear likeable. This scene, and the following one where Bob and Betty are reunited, find Peter Lorre at his best, from his assumption of benevolent regret at having to give Clive in charge, to his amused hands-up gesture when confronted by his accomplice's pistol, to his soft-spoken menace as he makes clear what Bob and Betty can expect. Good though the other cast members are, it's tempting to say that Laurie effortlessly steals every scene he appears in.
You mean Betty?
You know, to a man with a heart, he says, smiling disarmingly and pouring himself a drink, there can be nothing sweeter than a touching scene, such as a man saying goodbye to his child for the last time.
You know, to a man with a heart as soft as mine, there's nothing sweeter than a touching scene.
Such as?
Such as a father saying goodbye to his child. Yeah, goodbye for the last time. What could be more touching than that?
In fact, Abbott's right. The reunion between Bob and Betty is a very touching scene.
Why do you look at me like that?
Perhaps the most touching in the whole film. Bob's been portrayed throughout almost as a caricature of the stiff upper lip Englishman, deflecting emotion with jokes. Consider the way he tells Jill when he's heading off with Clive on the dangerous quest to look for his kidnapped daughter, "Oh, just leave me a bone on the mat." But this is the moment where he almost loses control of himself, though all that gives him away is a muttered, half-heard exclamation of "God," that luckily seems to have escaped the attention of Joseph Breen. Instead, knowing that he mustn't let Betty see his distress, he tries to distract her with talk about his dressing gown and her school report.
Betty. Betty, I want to tell you something. Here, boy. Listen, your school report's come. Awfully good. Really?
Even the gang members appear momentarily silenced by the scene. Only when the pair are physically pulled apart and Betty is dragged off does Bob's instinctive sang-froid momentarily desert him.
Where's Mummy?
Come on, tell her. At the Albert Hall, my dear. Oh, that reminds me.
Here we get a helpful sneak preview of Arthur Benjamin's Storm Cloud cantata. Of course, I forgot. Music is less in your line than marksmanship, says Abbott, slyly putting down Raymond as a Philistine. But by playing him a snatch of the piece that will be played out at the Albert Hall with its crucial percussion crash, he's letting us know as well just what to listen out for.
Now listen carefully. There. You see, at such a moment, your shot will not be heard.
And now we're coming to the film's grand set piece, the assassination attempt in the Albert Hall. Hitchcock loved to include big set-piece scenes in his films. Think of the hotel ballroom scene in Young and Innocent, the fight on the carousel in Strangers on a Train, the crop-dusting plane sequence in North by Northwest, the attack on the gas station in The Birds. But this is the first of them. It's also a further example of Hitch's liking for using famous locations and grand national monuments, which started with the blackmailer falling to his death through the glass roof of the British Museum reading room in Blackmail. So we have Westminster Cathedral in Foreign Correspondent, the Statue of Liberty in Saboteur, the Golden Gate Bridge in Vertigo, and of course the climax of North by Northwest famously plays out on Mount Rushmore. And in the present film, as in the remake, we have the Royal Albert Hall, London's largest and most grandiose concert hall. In the remake, with its far more lavish budget, Hitchcock was able to shoot much of the scene in the hall itself. But given the modest £45,000 total budget available for the first version, renting the hall for several days would have been prohibitive. A few establishing shots were taken in the lobby and the auditorium, but most of the sequence relies on a technique known as the Schuftan process. This was invented by the German cinematographer Eugen Schuftan for use in Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen and Metropolis, and it involves painting a miniature set on part of a mirror and then shooting the live action through a section of the mirror where the silvering has been scraped away. The painting in this case was provided by the Italian-born Royal Academician Fortunio Matania. The process was far cheaper and less time-consuming than building huge sets. The same technique was used for shooting part of the street scene in the film's final shootout. I'll point out a couple of the Schuftan shots when we get to them in a few moments. Hitchcock himself always denied having any particular musical skills or knowledge, but he showed himself remarkably astute at choosing composers to work with on his films. His most famous director-composer partnership, of course, was with Bernard Herrmann, whose masterly strings-only score for Psycho has become deservedly celebrated. But in his time, Hitchcock worked with some of the most distinguished movie composers. The creator of the piece we're about to hear, Arthur Benjamin, was the first of them. The Sydney-born composer Arthur Benjamin wrote serious music, but he also had his pulse on the popular music scene. His best-known single piece is his Jamaican Rumba. The first film he scored was Alexander Korda's The Scarlet Pimpernel, starring Leslie Howard, and his second, only a month or two later, was The Man Who Knew Too Much. His choral piece, The Storm Cloud Cantata, was probably the most elaborate piece that up to that time had ever been composed for a film, and Benjamin subtly prepares us for it from the very first. Over the opening shot of Swiss travel brochures and mountain vistas, we hear an ominous seven-note fanfare that forms a key theme of the cantata. We'll hear it again, transposed to a major key, at the very end of the film as Jill is reunited with her daughter. Throughout the film, Benjamin's score is witty and often parodistic. You can tell he enjoyed providing a lugubrious hymn tune for the sun worshippers in their chapel. So subtly and skillfully is the shuftan process used that it's often difficult to work out which are process shots and which the real thing. But where we see wide shots of the whole hall, they're almost certainly shuftan. Matania, we know, was asked to paint not just the interior of the hall, but the choir and the audience. When you can't see any of them moving, that's the giveaway. They're just painted figures. Here's a clever editing link. Hitchcock pulls focus on a microphone that's transmitting the concert. This is the first time we realise that the gang and Bob are listening in. It's almost as if Abbott's directing the assassination by remote control. Notice in this scene how Hitchcock subtly orchestrates the tension by gradually speeding up the cutting, making the shots shorter and shorter as we move towards the climactic moment of Jill's scream. There are nearly 80 cuts in this near 7-minute sequence, and from the moment Jill enters the auditorium, no dialogue at all, apart from the sung words of the cantata, and in one of the two brief cutaways to the gang listening to the concert on the radio, Rawlinson's impatient, "Is that it?" Hitch lets the staccato cutting and the dramatic score carry the scene. The words of the cantata are difficult to make out, but just before the fatal percussion clash, the soprano sings, "All save the child, all save the child, around whose head screaming the night birds wheeled and shot away." The close conjunction of the words "save the child" was surely not a coincidence, particularly since they play over a close-up of Jill's anguished face. Here, for the third time in the film, the screen fades to a blur in a subjective shot. The first was when Jill fainted in the hotel on learning that Betty had been kidnapped, the second when Clive was hypnotized, and now with Jill overcome with emotion as she struggles with her agonizing choice. Hitchcock seems to cut through her dilemma by having the muzzle of the gun nosing in from the side of the screen. This, he's telling us, is Jill's priority. This is what she must do. It's as though, after that brief moment of near fainting, her subconscious takes over and impels her to scream. And it's only after that, as though liberated, that she finds her voice, yelling to the police to pursue Raymond. But before that, Hitchcock tantalizingly cuts, not to the targeted statesman as we might expect, but back to the quiet, pseudo-domestic scene at the house, where Abbott and his accomplices, like a malign parody of a family, have been enjoying their dinner and listening to the concert on the radio, while Bob nervously puffs on a cigarette. "Sounds like it went off all right," says Rawlinson. Though, of course, we don't know yet, any more than he does, whether it did or not. Hitch keeps us in suspense on that point until we hear the radio announcement.
Follow that car. You come with me.
We're approaching the grand finale, the East End shootout. This whole sequence was inspired by, and closely modelled on, a famous real-life London event from 1911 known as the Siege of Sydney Street. On 16th December 1910, a group of East European immigrants tried to break into a jeweller's shop in Houndsditch, East London. The police were called, not knowing the gang were armed. 3 policemen were fatally shot and others wounded, while the gang made their getaway. On 2nd January 1911, an informant told the police that the gang, led by an anarchist known as Peter the Painter, were living in a house at 100 Sydney Street, Stepney. The next day, 200 armed police officers surrounded the building. The Home Secretary, an ambitious 37-year-old called Winston Churchill, arrived to direct the siege personally and ordered a detachment of Scots Guards to be brought in as backup. After 6 hours, the house caught fire, but Churchill refused to let the fire brigade gain access. Eventually, the police stormed the burnt-out building. 2 of the gang were found dead, but no trace of Peter the Painter was ever found. We've just heard the radio announcement that tells the gang, and us, that Raymond has failed in his attempt. Jill's scream has achieved its effect.
For your own sake, for dear little Betty's.
It's worth noting, incidentally, that not until the very final scene does Hitchcock make use of non-diegetic music, i.e. purely soundtrack music whose source we can't identify on the screen. All the other music, the dance music in the hotel, the hymn singing and organ playing in the chapel, the cantata in the Albert Hall and on the radio, can be linked to actual sources on screen. Benjamin's dramatic music picks up again, helping to build up the tension until it's cut off by the closing of the padded door. We're now into the end game as the gang realise they're trapped, though Abbott scarcely loses his cool.
Take a look.
Notice the ironic little smile as he nods towards the window where he spotted the police watching the apartment. In fact, even now with the bullets flying, he retains his composure until Nurse Agnes is hit by a shot. Then, for the first time, we see him show genuine anguish as he cradles her dying body in his arms. It's as if he harboured real love for this rather remote, angular woman. Only then, rather than simply loading guns for the others, will he pick up a revolver himself and start shooting with venom at the besieging police. Two more unconsciously doom-laden remarks.
Looks like an all-night job to me.
Not for him, it isn't. A little later, one of his colleagues, referring to the mattress he and another policeman are pulling into position by the window, says, "I could do with a sleep on that myself." He gets it, poor fellow, with a vengeance. Hitchcock's view of the police, here as always, is interestingly ambiguous. As he repeatedly claimed, he was terrified of them as the representatives of the law, and he frequently liked to tell his possibly apocryphal story of being locked in a police cell for a few minutes as a small boy. But at the same time, he often makes a point of humanising individual police officers, making us see them as people rather than grim functionaries, so that we feel for them when they're killed. Hitchcock and his team used newspaper photographs of the siege in setting up their scene, and the visual resemblances to photos of the real-life event are striking. There are also resemblances, though, to another of Fritz Lang's films, one that would have been in production not long before Hitchcock visited the UFA studios as an assistant director, the 1922 thriller Dr. Mabuse the Gambler, at whose climax the authorities attack Mabuse's headquarters. Two more of Hitchcock's characteristic touches of humour. First, the postman, stubbornly set on doing his job no matter what, and then a sardonic little joke at the expense of the police, with Inspector Binstead helping himself to free candy off the shop counter, watched with some concern by the shopkeeper. A moment later, another comic moment to offset the tension. Binstead has to gulp his sweet down hurriedly when addressed by the government minister.
Anything further, Binstead?
No, sir. We can't do anything against it with revolvers, so I've sent to try and raise some rifles.
As we can see, Hitchcock took little notice of the censor's worries about armed police operating on the streets of London. The police waste little time in getting hold of revolvers, and when these prove insufficient, they soon augment their arsenal with a truckload of rifles from a nearby gunsmith. All these weapons they seem to handle with accustomed familiarity. Not quite, one would imagine, what the British censor thought of as in accord with ordinary police methods in London.
Very good, sir. You take charge of the firing party. I'll send the men in to you.
And clear the people out of the houses you occupy. Very good, sir. Where's your backyard? Through the kitchen, this way.
An overhead shot of some typical working-class backyards. A studio set again, but with a strong sense of authenticity. Notice, as we follow the police clambering over the walls, odd tools and bits of junk lying around in the yards, just as there would be in backyards like these. Hitchcock, who had grown up in just such a milieu as a greengrocer's son in Leytonstone, East London, always had a feel for this kind of setting, and would demonstrate it again in the South London street scenes of Sabotage. For those critics who prefer Hitchcock's British films to his American output, this intimate sense of milieu is something he lost when he moved to Hollywood.
Much better if you waited outside, you know.
I only come in to see if everything was all right.
Another oblique comment on police methods, the way the old man's piano, one of his few treasured possessions we might guess, is casually commandeered to stop any stray bullets. For a split second, the poor old fellow looks as if he might protest, but then he resignedly helps the cops shift the instrument into position. It's another example of Hitch's sympathy with ordinary working-class lives. And we could even see it as replaying in miniature a key theme of the film, the droop-moustached old fellow, just like the Lawrences and so many other Hitchcock protagonists, has found himself, through no fault of his own, caught up in events way beyond his control.
Give you a bit of cover.
I've come straight off point duty. I could do with a bit of a sleep on that myself. Still warm, too.
Yeah, tell your missus about it.
An odd detail in this scene about the shooting of the second policeman. He quite clearly ducks down before the window shatters from the bullet, and his head is well below the windowsill, yet he's still shot dead. The actor playing him, incidentally, is Frank Atkinson, one of only 2 cast members to appear in both versions of the film, 1934 and 1956. The other is Betty Bascom, who's in the same scene. She plays the young woman who a few moments previously was sleeping on the same mattress. Another tiny role in the film was played by a woman who was to become more important in Hitchcock's life than anyone except his wife Alma. Joan Harrison appears for all of 5 seconds and without a word of dialogue as the pretty girl, billed only as secretary, we see dining with Abbott just before Louis Bernard is shot. It was her sole screen role, but she was to play a much longer key role in Hitchcock's career. Aged 26, educated and well-bred, she became his personal assistant, script consultant, amanuensis, honorary family member, and eventually the producer of all his television series.
There must be some way through to the house. Try all these doors. Come on, boys. Try the doors.
The Man Who Knew Too Much took exactly 2 months to shoot, from the 2nd of June to the 2nd of August 1934. It went slightly over budget. Originally budgeted at £42,833, it wound up costing $45,736, or some $180,000 at the exchange rate prevailing in the mid-1930s. This wasn't disastrous. It was generally assumed at Gaumont British that most films would incur some slight excess of costs. Even so, the production hit major problems. This was thanks to Hitchcock's nemesis, the distributor C.M. Wolfe, who was one of the company directors. Wolfe and Hitchcock had already crossed swords back in 1926, when as chairman of Gainsborough he had damned The Lodger as arty, incomprehensible and totally unshowable. The film was saved by the intervention of Michael Balkan, who asked Ivor Montague to do a tactful re-editing job, and The Lodger had gone on to triumph both critically and at the box office, hailed as one of the finest British silent films. Wolfe, though, was never a man to admit his mistakes. While The Man Who Knew Too Much was in post-production, Balkan went off to Los Angeles on a fishing trip for Hollywood stars to appear in Gaumont British Productions, leaving Wolfe in charge of the studio. Viewing the completed film, Wolfe announced that it was appallingly made and utterly ridiculous, and that the studio couldn't possibly release it as it was. He proposed to bring in Maurice Elvey, a prolific and reliable workhorse director, also under contract to Gaumont British, to reshoot much of the footage. He also announced that Hitchcock and Bennett would be taken off their next project, The 39 Steps, and assigned to a mindless musical biopic. Disaster was averted by the return of Walken, to whom Hitchcock and Bennett had been firing off desperate telegrams. Wolfe was overruled, and The Man Who Knew Too Much was scheduled for release as Hitchcock had shot it. The Man Who Knew Too Much was premiered on 8th December 1934 at the Academy Cinema in Oxford Street and garnered enthusiastic reviews. Wolfe, however, still wasn't through with it. Since his company, W&F, controlled all Gaumont British's distribution, he put the film into release as the lower half of a double bill. Second features were booked at a flat £5 fee, so although The Man Who Knew Too Much broke attendance records, it technically lost money. This didn't deter Gaumont British's publicity department. The press campaign majored strongly on Laurie's part in the film, dubbing him Public Enemy #1 of all the world and Lord High Minister of everything sinister. He treats his captives, burbled a press release, with the extreme of unctuous courtesy. Dracula's, Frankensteins and ghouls are just so many weaklings to this criminal of all crime. Despite Wolfe's machinations, The Man Who Knew Too Much scored a critical triumph, widely hailed as Hitchcock's return to form after the uncertainties and byways of his years at BIP. C.A. Lejeune of The Observer pronounced herself very happy about this film. It seems to me, because of its very recklessness, its frank refusal to deal in subtleties, to be the most promising work that Hitchcock has produced since Blackmail. The critic of the Daily Express felt that Hitchcock leaps again into the front rank of British directors. And on BBC Radio, Alistair Cook welcomed the director's familiar mastery of a slow, ominous tempo, passages of breathless, tantalising cutting, and some psychological detail which advances him in the path previously trodden by Fritz Lang. Hitchcock, a great admirer of Lang's films, must have been gratified by the comparison. It wasn't only the British censor who was concerned about our film. For some reason, the script was never submitted to the American Production Code Administration, or Hays Office as it was commonly known. And when they saw the completed film prior to its US release, several matters troubled them, most notably the final gun battle. There is too much slaughter, too much gunplay, too much murdering of policemen, wrote Joseph Ignatius Breen, ultra-Catholic head of the Hays Office. A mere handful of assassins hold off the British police, at the close of which 20 or 30 of the police are killed, and all the assassins. In fact, we see 4 policemen killed at most, and a few more wounded. You can't help wondering if Breen's alarm may have affected his arithmetic. The film was approved by the Hays Office on 13th February 1935, but only after numerous cuts had been inflicted, shortening it by some 5 minutes.
Betty!
Here, once again, we have that favourite Hitchcock theme, the universal fear of falling from a high place.
Quick, get that man.
Again, sir. Might hit the kiddie.
And now we've come to the moment foreshadowed at the very start of the film, when Jill told Raymond, "We must have another battle someday." They do indeed. A battle for her daughter's life. US critics were no less enthused by the film. So sure is Hitchcock's touch in creating an electric atmosphere that the audience is enthralled, commented the New York Times. Richard Watts in the Herald Tribune was even more lavish in his praise. It is the best crime melodrama of the season and beats Hollywood in its chosen field, that of shrewd, ominous and dynamic melodrama, he wrote. In the shooting script, Abbott, like Peter the Painter, gets clean away. The police hear the watch chiming behind the door. But when it's pulled back, all that's there is the watch itself, left hanging from a hook. But the British censor wouldn't wear the idea of the gang leader going unpunished, and so Abbott had to die. The Man Who Knew Too Much became the first of Hitchcock's films to score a major success in America. And inevitably, Hollywood took notice. The first tentative offers from the movie capital started arriving very soon after the US premiere. Initially, they were quietly deflected by Michael Balkan, but it could only be a matter of time. With The Man Who Knew Too Much, Hitchcock's future starts to be mapped out as a man who will become not only a major Hollywood director, but perhaps the most famous film director in the world.